Lords of War, Orcs vs. Dwarves, Volume 1. Written by Martin Vaux and read by Tom Barratt. Part 4. Eyes in the Sky. Thalen Haddon stalked ever onwards, the two young dwarves to his side watching him, trying to imitate his movements. They studied him, seeing him stop and listen to the deep wood, the rustles of leaves and feathered wings, the creaking of boughs, the clicks and murmurs of the undergrowth. There was a light drizzle falling above the thick canopy. The ancient trees with their long, thick trunks and branches flushed with rich blue-green needles stretched high above them, blocking out most of the light and the worst of the weather. Still, as they strode, the band of three were heavy with the damp droplets of water slipping through their beards like shivers up the spine. Thalen took a step, gingerly negotiating his bare feet over a long, gnarled root. As he did, he raised his fist and froze. The two younger dwarves followed suit. Slowly, Thalen reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, decorative throwing axe. He looked at the young dwarves out of the corners of his eyes and beckoned them to move silently closer, close enough that they might see what he saw. The young dwarves crept through the undergrowth and beheld the object of Thalen's attention. Before them, a little way into the distance, a stag stood, bristling with the falling misty rain, his coat long, his antlers filthy with moss and earth. Thalen raised the throwing axe and tossed it, watching it sail through the air, landing with an audible chopping sound in the space between the stag's neck and shoulder blade. The animal took a step sideways, streams of hot breaths shooting out of its mouth and nostrils as mist. The stag looked bewildered, affronted, emitting a low, snuffling wail. As it tried to walk forward, its legs went weak, and it fell, kicking and panicked onto the forest floor. Any pretense of silence between the young dwarves and their teacher was abandoned then. Thalen, followed by the young would-be hunters, strode purposefully towards the fallen beast. It lay in pain, struggling, trying to get up and run. "Seems a shame to kill such a beauty," said one of the young dwarves. Thalen didn't respond. He approached the stag's head, gripping its antlers, and grimaced. "Hamilcar's blessings, old one," he said quietly. Then he twisted the antlers, breaking the creature's neck. He removed his throwing axe, cleaned it on the animal's hide, and replaced it in his belt. "Adram, you carry it," said Thalen. "I think that's quite enough for one day." One of the young dwarves heaved the stag's carcass onto his back, and the party of three began their slow walk back to Ragnar's Folly. The outpost would be a half-day's walk, and leaving now meant that the party should be back by nightfall. They had left the previous morning and spent the day and evening in the field, learning to track, stalk, and blend in with their environment. In these fields, Thalen Haddon was the closest the dwarves of the Western Breach had to a master. The old dwarf was Master Ranger at Blackstone, a larger vanguard outpost further north, closer to the Iron Teeth Mountains and the heart of the Dwarven Empire. He travelled south to Mace and Evenstar and eventually to Ragnar's Folly each year, taking up new apprentices, teaching, hunting, and travelling with the most promising candidates back up to Blackstone. This year, neither Mace nor Evenstar had boasted a single potential candidate. This year had been a bad year after another bad year after another bad year, stretching back as far as he cared to remember. This might be the last time he visited Ragnar's Folly. There was barely enough dwarves there now to maintain the fort, let alone constitute a community. Soon the residents would have to pack up and move on, like innumerable communities had already done on the Eastern Breach. Between the orc raids on the southernmost outpost and the dwindling numbers of dwarves born every year, ever since the Blight, there were fewer banishments from the mountain communities, fewer pregnancies in the topsider outposts, and fewer still dwarves on the homesteads. Thalen knew, in his heart, that the dwarven race was in retreat, but he was never one for surrender. Never had been, never would be. The young dwarves following the old hunter watched and walked with him, but both were afraid to speak. There were rumours about him, legends that had built up over time like rust on a blade. It was said that he could identify any plant, knew which would poison, which was safe to eat, what medical property each boasted. It was said that he never wore boots, that his connection to the earth was so strong that at night, while he slept, his feet grew into roots. It was said that he could summon creatures to him, that he could speak to them, that he could communicate with the birds in flight, seeing with their eyes, tracking with them, stalking with them, sailing through the clouds with them. Where legend began and the man ended, the young dwarves were afraid to guess. They didn't want to presume. They wanted to know. As the trio reached the edge of the deep forest, the trees began to thin, becoming smaller, their reign over the skyline less absolute. As the dwarves travelled, one of the young dwarves piped up, unable to contain all the questions bubbling up inside him. "Master Hayden," he asked. The old dwarf turned and grunted. "Is it true what they say, that you can fly with the birds?" Thalen continued to walk, smiling grimly. "Who is they, boy?" "Everyone. I mean, some of them, the older dwarves." Thalen nodded, but didn't respond. He just kept walking, his feet caked in mud, accumulating a solid layer of pine needles, green, brown, and sweet-smelling. As they reached the edge of the forest and stepped out onto the wet, rolling wild of the plains, Thalen scanned the horizon ahead, then took in the panorama, looking from the sheer right to sheer left. As he did this, he froze. "Look," he said, nodding to the south. A long wisp of smoke curled up into the sky on the horizon, barely perceptible. The two young dwarves would never have noticed it or thought to look, but there it was, miles away. 2, perhaps 3 days' walk. All that was down that way was homestead lands. Thalen closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He brought his hands in towards his stomach, holding the backs of one set of fingers against those on the other hand. He flexed the muscles of his shoulders, pushing the backs of his hands together, and exhaled violently. Above the band of 3, a screech sounded, followed by another. There was a flurry of wings in the distance, and Ranger Haddon fell to one knee, tucking his legs underneath him, crossing them and taking a seat. He then raised both of his hands aloft, stretching his arms out as far as they might reach. Like an arrow sailing through the air, guiding itself unaffected by the earth's pull or the influence of the winds, a falcon spiraled from out of view, its great wingspan extending, slowing its descent. Its feet, boasting claws which glinted sharp and black as razors, were pushed out as if hunting, seeking something to grasp. With little grace, the falcon landed on one of Thalen's open, leather-gloved hands. The bird screeched, opening its savagely curved beak, but Thalen showed no fear. He rustled the fingers of his free hand through the falcon's plumage, whispering to it quietly in tones which the young dwarves could not hear or understand. As the old ranger spoke, the falcon brought its head closer to Thalen's mouth, staring with one beady eye at the young dwarves. Whatever discourse passed between the two was quickly over, and Thalen seemed to throw the falcon back into the sky. It shot into the grey sky, hurtling towards the source of the smoke on the horizon. At that moment, another falcon came in to land on Thalen's hand, and he repeated the process, the quiet whispers, the tender strokes of fingers on feathers. The falcon screeched, waddling awkwardly on Thalen's slipped glove. "Do either of you have paper, parchment, anything to write with?" The young dwarves were startled almost to hear the old ranger addressing them directly. Both shook their heads, stating in low tones that they did not. Thalen went back to whispering to the falcon, which screeched again more loudly. In response, Thalen held the head of the bird in his free hand, closing his eyes and whispering comfortingly. He then threw the bird up into the sky, and it took flight in a completely alternative direction, back towards Ragnar's Folly. "We need to move, and fast," said Thalen. He began to stride into the open field, then started to run. The two dwarves followed suit, the one carrying the deer carcass, struggling somewhat to stop it from slipping. "Master Haddon," he appealed, "the stag, "Leave it," came the response, half bellow, half growl. The young dwarf dropped the dead animal and picked up the pace. As he did, Thalen thought dark thoughts and feared them. This may turn out to be a worse year yet, he thought to himself. If he was right, which he sincerely hoped he was not, then it would appear that orcs were afield. If this were the case, if Orcs were afield, no amount of food or preparation would help now. It could mean only one thing. The invasion had begun.